obviously a usual bin Laden exaggeration. And then he said, and I pray to God that he permits us to turn America into a shadow of itself. Those were his words. And in my notebook, which I actually took these words down in, I put 2 lines on each side of the quote at the time and wrote rhetoric, question mark. It wasn't, of course. And I remember that, on 9/11, I said before, I think to you, that, I was crossing the Atlantic that day, the plane turned around. And when I got back to Europe and saw the biblical crashing of the Twin Towers, I remember thinking, well, New York is now a shadow of itself, all that dust and fog going across the city. I was pretty convinced from the start that bin Laden was involved. I still am, of course.
You have chosen a section of your book, Great War for Civilization,
highly subversive section,
to read, deleting any curses or anything like that. If you could read a piece.
I've chosen a piece that has no bad language, which is permitted on British television but not on American television. Yes, it's rather fits in rather well with the news today and what you've just been talking about. It's about the issue of our rationale of how we behave in Iraq. The Americans and British benefited from the accounts of terror under Saddam. Would you rather he was still here in Iraq, torturing and gassing his own people, they would ask? Don't you think we did a good thing by getting rid of him? All this, of course, because the original reasons for the invasion, Saddam's possession of weapons of mass destruction, his links with the outrages of September 11th, Mr. Blair's 45-minute warning, turned out to be lies. But it was a dark comparison that Bush and Blair were making. If Saddam's immorality and wickedness had to be the yardstick against which all of our own iniquities were judged, what did that say about us? If Saddam's regime was to be the moral compass to define our actions, how bad, how iniquitous did that allow us to be? Saddam tortured and executed women in Abu Ghraib. We only sexually abused prisoners and killed a few of them and murdered some suspects in Bagram in Afghanistan and subjected them to inhuman treatment in Guantanamo. Saddam was much worse. And thus it became inevitable that the symbol of Saddam's shame, the prison at Abu Ghraib, subsequently became the symbol of our shame too. What was interesting was the vastly different reaction in East and West to our abuses in Iraq and Afghanistan. We civilized Westerners were shocked at the dog-biting and humiliations and torture our men and women administered to the inmates. Iraqis were outraged but not shocked. Their friends and relatives, some of whom have been locked up by the Americans, had long ago told them of the revolting behavior of the American guards. They weren't surprised by those iconic photographs. They already knew. By early 2004, an army of thousands of mercenaries had appeared on the streets of Iraq's major cities, many of them former British and American soldiers hired by the occupying Anglo-American authorities and by dozens of companies who feared for the lives of their employees in Baghdad. Heavily armed Britons working for well over 300 security firms in Iraq now outnumbered Britain's 8,000-strong army in the south of the country. Although major US and British security companies were operating in Iraq, dozens of small firms also set up shop with little vetting of their employees and few rules of engagement. Many of the Britons were former SAS soldiers. Hundreds of former American Special Forces men were also in the country, while armed South Africans were also working for the occupation authorities. The presence in Iraq of so many thousands of Western mercenaries, or security contractors, as the American press coyly referred to them, said as much about America's fear of taking military casualties as it did about the multi-million-pound security industry now milking the coffers of the US and British governments. Security firms were escorting convoys on the highways of Iraq. Armed plainclothes men from an American company were guarding US troops at night inside the former presidential palace where Paul Bremer had his headquarters. In other words, security companies were now guarding the occupation troops. When a US helicopter crashed near Fallujah in 2003, it was an American security company that took control of the area and began rescue operations. Needless to say, casualties among the mercenaries were not included in the regular body count put out by the occupation authorities. The latest figure that I have as a journalist now is that we now have in Iraq 120,000 Western mercenaries. That's almost equal to the total number of American troops.
And in your experience
Ouch.
in Iraq, having been there, how much did you run into these mercenaries?
Oh, they would turn up and stay in the same hotel I was in. They turned up doing checkpoints on roads, sometimes wearing hoods or masks. Why? Why hoods? Why masks? What were they doing? I would come across them driving vehicles through the streets of Baghdad, guns pointing out the window, get out of the way, get out of the way, get out of the way, in the air. very similar to the same gangs that Saddam used to use for security purposes to get people out of the way in vehicles. In fact, the way in which the occupation authorities have sealed off vast areas of Baghdad with walls is classic. It wasn't as bad under Saddam, there weren't so many walls, but it's very similar to the same practice that Saddam's regime used. In fact, in many ways, what we do has become a kind of pale mirror of the regime we got rid of. Hanging people and their heads come off when you hang them. This is incredible.
Congressman John Murtha, the former Marine who basically channeled the Pentagon and came out early on, he was first for the war, came out against and called for withdrawal, said yesterday that that the U.S. military should destroy Abu Ghraib, should pull the troops out of Saddam's palaces, and should close Guantanamo.
Look, we've been through Abu Ghraib so often. First of all, it was liberated, and we all went in and saw the hangman's noose and where they were where Saddam's people were executed. Then they announced they would have to use it briefly as a prison. I said, immediately I went to prison, I said, they'll use it as a prison again, because they always do. And they did. And then when one Iraqi historian said it should be turned into a museum of Saddam's horror. This is Kanan Makia, of course. And then, after the abuses were made photographically evident at Abu Ghraib, it was announced by the then Iraqi government that it was going to be bulldozed to the ground. And then it was announced that, after all, it was still needed as a prison, so it would stay as a prison for more abuses, perhaps. And now, again, we have this suggestion it should be razed to the ground. Later on, it'll be stated that we still need it as a prison. Then we'll hear yet again that it has to be razed to the ground. You don't realize, unless you go to Iraq, that this is a circular track. All the stories we report, we reported last year, and we're going to report them again next year, believe me.
I wanted to ask you about Dick Cheney. The so-called coalition of the willing in Iraq continues to shrink. 2 members recently announced they're withdrawing troops. Denmark says its battalion will pull out of Iraq by August and increase its troop presence in Afghanistan. This followed British Prime Minister Tony Blair's announcement of a pending withdrawal of 1,600 British troops from Iraq. After Blair made the announcement, Vice President Dick Cheney issued what some called a tacit criticism of Britain's withdrawal.
I want you to know that the American people will not support a policy of retreat. We want to complete the mission, we want to get it done right, and then we want to return home with honor.
Vice President Dick Cheney.
Well, you've got to remember that at one point it looked as if the Brits might pull out of the original invasion. And Rumsfeld made a statement rather similar to Cheney's, saying, well, we can do it without them. I'm still wondering what on earth Britain is doing in Iraq and how we ever got into it. One of the extraordinary things at the moment about both Iraq and Afghanistan is that our leaderships, British just as much as Americans, have lied continually. They've lied about weapons of mass destruction, links between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, 45-minute warnings, as I said. But this is the first war I've ever covered in which the leadership in the West bases its policies on its own lies. I mean, it's one thing to lie to the people and then you have your own policy of how to pursue a war, but to pursue the war on the basis of the lies you're telling the people, this is an entirely new concept in war and strategy and foreign policy. I've never seen it before. You have Blair standing up now in the British Parliament. Well, less and less, thank goodness. I mean, soon he's going, because of Iraq, of course, and because of his relationship with Bush. And he keeps saying the same thing over and over again. I absolutely and completely believe I was right. And that's not good enough. We can all believe we're right. We can jump off the Empire State Building believing we can fly, but we won't fly, will we? And Blair actually thinks that his conviction, his own self-regard, is sufficient to make up for the factual mistakes that he makes. It's okay, because he really believed it. That's not the way you go to war.
Why do you think Tony Blair is pulling these troops out, although at the same time increasing troops in Afghanistan, and what do you think of that?
I'll tell you why I think he's doing it. I think that the British military is having serious morale problems. I think that the British military commanders are getting to a point where they're going to say, we can't do this anymore, we're going to resign. When the Chief of Staff, Dannett, made his statement at the Ministry of Defence about 4 months ago, which he said, look, the longer we stay there, the more we're exacerbating the situation. It was a great shock for Blair. This was not a retired officer like Mike Jackson, who I think very cowardly did not say those things when he was in office. This was the guy at the top of the British Army giving a clear warning, watch out. And, in Afghanistan, the British are in a very serious position. They've got units of only 12 or 15 men in little villages, and they're being attacked in company strength by the Taliban. Very serious. I mean, I met a